me read the second part of that quote, which is incredibly like traumatic and emotionally triggering to read. It was cheaper to use Black people than cats because we were everywhere and we were considered cheap experimental animals.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. Over the last 4 decades, the United Nations has proclaimed November 29th as a day of solidarity with the people of Palestine. There were 3 actions of note on November 29th in New England. In Boston, there was a protest that highlighted the $130 million of Massachusetts tax money that goes to Israel each year. Of course, this year, after Israel's bloody pounding of Gaza, the United States House voted to give Israel an extra $1 billion on top of the $3.8 billion it already gets each year. Protesters met with aides to Senator Markey and Senator Warren. This sign asks Congress to pass Resolution 571. That resolution calls on Israel to reverse its decision to call 6 major Palestinian human rights groups terrorist organizations.
We need to fix our broken healthcare system. We need to fix our broken housing system. So many people on the streets, so many evictions. These are the needs. We need to fix our grossly unequal school system. There are so many things we need to do at home. We do not need to give Israel from Massachusetts all this money to kill and oppress Palestinians. And this is a message we are going to be taking to the senators who are going to come and receive our letters signed by 28 Massachusetts-based organizations.
There's 3 things I want to say about this. Number 1 is that all of these things are connected, right? We're talking about a mass ideology of racial capitalism, patriarchal colonialism that is sickening every piece of who we are. When we show up for Palestine, we are showing up for climate justice because that ideology thinks that people are expendable, land is expendable for profit, for exploitation. That's right. It's all connected. That's the first thing I want to say. The second thing I want to say is this is urgent. This is urgent, and I don't mean that like in a white supremacist culture way. I mean people are suffering now every night in Palestine, every night, every day here in the deep heart of the empire in the US, right? We have got to make progress on this, and it has to heal quickly. For 500 years, indigenous people on this continent and so-called US have been fighting. It is urgent that we heal racial capitalism, patriarchal colonialism. And now I want to talk about climate justice. Anybody here ever felt stressed when winter comes because you know your utility bill is going up? Anybody felt that? Yeah. Under the pandemic, this has gotten worse and worse. There are major sources of emissions that, climate dorks talk about, whether it's transportation or electric grid. But the third big one that we have not figured out is how we heat our buildings, how we stay warm in the winter. My first apartment in Boston, literally I stuffed toilet paper in the cracks of the window because otherwise I would feel the breeze in the winter. There would be ice on the inside of my window. There are people right now cold and trying to heat their homes with oil, with gas. What would I do? How would I divest from Israel occupation and invest in Massachusetts? I'll tell you, without a blink of an eye, I would put people to work, making our homes efficient, electric, and powered by local renewable clean energy. Hands down, and I would target low-income people of color households because they are cold And we need a warm home, not a hot planet.
I think this is actually a special time to be standing in solidarity with Palestinian people. This day, this International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people has been commemorated for many years, but I think 2021 is different. I think that what happened in May this year, the horrific Israeli violence, unfortunately, it wasn't the first time that Israel carried out that kind of violence, but it hit different this year, right? And I think that was for a number of reasons. One is what Palestinian folks have been doing in Palestine and in this country to refuse to be made invisible. More and more people are seeing Palestine and seeing Palestinians. We cannot ignore it. The other thing is that more and more people, I think, are seeing this country. They're seeing the US and they're seeing Palestine and seeing them together. That is, when you look at what the police are doing to Black people across this country, when your eyes are open to that, those same eyes look at what the police are doing to Palestinians. The same police who are training with each other, right? And you see it differently. If you look at the border wall and the horrendous suffering that takes place at the borders of this country, and you see the border walls that Israel's building, they're building walls all across on all their borders. You see the Israeli technology on the US-Mexico border. You see it all together.
This picture of a 7-foot representation of a Palestinian woman was among the photos taken at the demonstration in Manchester, New Hampshire. This is a photo of a protest in Vermont. now the second section of Christopher Sebastian's Shafer Lecture for promoting enduring peace. Last week, he ended by talking about how the Japanese diet, which had been almost all vegetarian, changed after seeing what the victorious U.S. GIs were consuming. Among the things Sebastian talks about in this section is how a publicist made America hunger after bacon.
I just wanted to talk very briefly about animal experimentation too, and how it relates to race and class. This is a quote from the book Medical Apartheid. It says, "The future of the Negro lies more in the research laboratory than in the schools. When diseased, he should be registered and forced to take treatment before he offers his diseased mind and body on the altar of academic and professional education. It was cheaper to use niggers than cats because they were everywhere and cheap experimental animals." And that's a quote from neurosurgeon Harry Bailey in the 1960s. And thank you, Roger, the ICI, smoking beagles. This is important because when you read the second part of that quote, which is incredibly traumatic and emotionally triggering to read, it was cheaper to use Black people than cats because we were everywhere and we were considered cheap experimental animals. Again, saying the quiet part out loud. We are animals ourselves within the system. And so it seems really weird to me that we would choose to to aspire to be more like our oppressors, and we'll get into that more later on in the presentation, rather than choosing solidarity with other animals. And I also wanted to point out that so often when I talk about these things, people say, oh, you're comparing Black people to animals, and that and that invalidates this discussion because it makes me deeply uncomfortable. No, I'm actually just observing that the comparison is already there, and it was made 100 years before you and I were even born. And it's an oppressive construction for everyone involved, and it is rooted in white supremacy. And so how are we going to fight for Black liberation and try to separate it from animal liberation? We create this binary where these things are in opposition to one another, where Black liberation has to come at the expense of or instead of animal liberation, or vice versa. When in reality, both of us are oppressed communities who are experiencing the residual harms of white supremacy throughout Western civilization for hundreds of years. So I'm going to move on from that. And I just wanted to add another quote also from the book Medical Apartheid, because as late as 1995, in case the 1960s was not recent enough for us, radiation scientist Clarence Lushbaugh explained that he and his partner Eugene Sagner chose slum patients as radiation subjects because these persons don't have any money and they're Black and they're poorly washed. And again, it says the quiet part out loud. Not only are we cheap experimental animals, but it when you have people who are part of the medical establishment specifically pointing out that it is because of lack of material wealth, because of race and our racial clarification, and because of our poorly washed appearance, or the the lack of what people would call the trappings of civilization or participation in civilized society. This is part of what makes someone an animal. These are all of the markers or characteristics that would make someone an animal. And it has so much to do with material wealth, with capitalism, and being non-white. And and this is these are all of the things that collectively make the Black struggle for myself so remarkably consistent with the struggle for animal liberation and necessary to actually achieve together, and meaningfully makes them not opposite from one another. And since we are in the 20th century, like I said, I'm sailing through this really quick because I wanted to move as quickly as possible and try to keep it at 30 minutes. I just wanted to observe some of the other ways in which race and social class and and white supremacy interact with one another. This is an image of Edward Bernays, and a lot of people, I love telling kids this in the classroom, a lot of people don't understand Edward Bernays and the importance of his work as the father of modern propaganda, or as he renamed it, public relations. which is itself an act of propaganda. Bernays is actually the nephew of Sigmund Freud, or he was the nephew of Sigmund Freud. He wrote the book on propaganda. But the reason why I think that it's so compelling to bring him up in the classroom, especially when having conversations about speciesism, is because, in particular, in the United States, we have this relationship with one food, and that food is bacon. We have this almost cult-like worship around bacon. And if you ask the average person, they'll tell you that they absolutely just love bacon. It's just something they love. And it's divorced from any sort of critical analysis of why you may love that particular food. And a lot of it goes back to Edward Bernays, who during the 1920s was approached by the Beechnut Packing Company because they wanted to sell more pork. And Bernays had written to thousands, I think up to 5,000 doctors around the country, which was no easy task in the 1920s, because it's not like he could send them an email. And he asked them if a heavier breakfast would be better for the American public than a simple breakfast, which doctors largely at the time agreed that it would be. And so he had launched a campaign of selling bacon and eggs to the public. And that was the first wave of of making bacon a staple food among people in the United States and broadly around the world after that, because American imperialism doesn't happen in isolation, does it? And that's just one of several waves of bacon mania that had oh, thank you so much, Roger, for actually putting that that recommendation in there. Please, definitely, like I said, check the chat. There are going to be awesome recommendations for books, articles, or pieces from other people in there, where you can do all of the research on this yourself. Bacon also holds such a significant place in the American consciousness because of its because of it being a very specific food that fuels white supremacy, in that Jewish people have prohibitions against eating pork, and Muslim people have prohibitions against eating pork. And we'll talk about that a little bit too, in how that manifests in the 21st century. But this specific use of that that particular food is it's fascinating to observe how it just skyrocketed in consumption, all because of the levers that have been put in place by the machine of capitalism, and by specific people, in the service again of white supremacist institutions over and over again. So no, I can't accept that you just quote love bacon, independently of any of the other social, cultural, or political and economic factors that have influenced that decision that you need to love this particular food. Nothing occurs in a bubble. And this is animals are deployed in various ways within our culture, and the objectification and exploitation of them, it just manifests in so many ways that we're very, very unconscious of, and we really, really need to investigate in order to better unpack our relationships with other animals. And this is from AmericanTable.org. Believe it or not, bacon's association with the American breakfast is barely a century old. Before this, the majority of Americans ate more modest, often meatless breakfasts that might include fruit, a grain porridge, or a roll, and usually a cup of coffee, which I would like to point out is generally a vegan breakfast. And so we treat the non-consumption or the absence of animal products from our diet as something that is weird and foreign, and that that is just completely unimaginable. But that's a part of just the bigoted imagination that we have, or the mindset that we have, that can't conceive of a world without animal exploitation, when in reality it's actually it was quite common up until very recently. We have very, very short cultural memories, and we've got a lot of deprogramming to do. And we see it, and we see animal consumption, talking about Edward Bernays and just piggybacking off of that, all up in our advertising all of the time, all throughout the 20th century and in the 21st century. There's absolutely no reason why we would be consuming, or why we should be consuming food from this person, Colonel Sanders, you can see here, who's dressed in the costume of a 19th century plantation owner. And and it seems so weird to me that we never interrogate the fact that this is this is the iconography that we're given around this particular food product, and we're not disturbed by that. We're not disturbed by the fact that that this is happening. We're not we don't observe the way that race is so deeply tied up in and and made again present in our food choices and our food consumption. And we're not taught to question it, which is very unfortunate. And like as we get into the 21st century now, like I just wanted to share, and a lot of this, there's like a political analysis that I had written for my thesis called like white meat. And so a few of these examples are going to come from there. And so this is a video actually of Sarah Palin from the All-American New Year's Eve a few years ago when Fox News was actually just talking to her. And so it's about a minute and a half long, and I'm going to play it. And I think that it's actually very revealing. So I'm going to mute myself and play the audio from the computer. Give me one moment. And so what you're seeing here is like, is the use of meat as a dog whistle to like, to who is considered to be a quote true American. There was no reason for her to actually talk about meat eating right now. She was talking about her New Year's resolution. She wasn't confronted with like a group of rabid vegans or anything. There wasn't any reason for me to come up in the conversation except to be used in that context. And so what you're seeing is the marriage of meat with a true American quote identity. And so like, and who isn't eating meat is not considered like truly American. So she starts with that dog whistle and then she progresses all the way up to American exceptionalism. And so you see the instrumentalization of meat in this way, and the exploitation of and the consumption of animals in the physical sense and in the metaphorical sense in order to reinforce these white supremacist institutions and white supremacist ideologies. Are there any non-rabid vegans? Actually, I don't know. I am so aggressively vegan, and I am so aggressively Black, and I am so aggressively gay that I think that that's the only way to characterize myself is like rabid in these senses. So but there are other examples as well. That one was
joining us now.
I think, yikes! I'm so sorry about that. That was from I think like 2014, 2015 or something like that. But just a year and a half ago, like during the CPAC, the Conservative Political Action conference. It's in the image. It's from 2019. What you're seeing, animalizing is a rabbit is an animalizing term, but like I don't have a problem with that myself because like I don't have a problem with animals. Deconstructing language and and the use of it in that way is kind of important. But this is an image of Sebastian Gorka, and he's talking at CPAC, and he's talking about like the quote Green New Deal, and he's saying what they want to do. And I quote him here: they want to take your pickup truck, they want to rebuild your home, they want to take away your hamburgers. This is what Stalin dreamt about but never achieved. You're on the front lines of the war against communism, coming back to America under the guise of democratic socialism. And so you're seeing here, there's a mysterious they. He doesn't actually name who they are, but they're absent from this. It doesn't matter who they are. It's just about the fear mongering and the marriage of very specific things to communism. And so again, you're seeing this setup of like a very specific type of white nationalist identity that's being built here, and he's building it around having a pickup truck. Having a very specific type of home that I guess he doesn't want to be rebuilt, although we have terrible problems with infrastructure in the United States. And most specifically, he closes with, they want to take away your hamburgers. Meat as something that is symbolic of your freedom as an American citizen is something that is integral to the racist imagination and to the white national identity.
Promoting enduring peace has added to its ideas on avoiding climate collapse a call to stop the use of off-road gas-powered engines like the ones used to power leaf blowers and lawnmowers. The two main reasons are to stop greenhouse gas emissions and to prevent toxicity among the lawn care workers and everyday consumers. This week, the Connecticut Hearst papers published my opinion piece outlining PEP's climate ideas. To read it, go to the pepeace.org homepage and scroll down to this section. You no doubt know that the three men put on trial for the killing of Ahmad Arbery were convicted. In Democracy Now! Coverage, Amy Goodman finds this segment about what the three defendants' lawyer used as a way to appeal to the white jury.
Defense attorney Laura Hogue, who represents Greg Michael, the former police officer, blamed Arbery's own actions for his death, and she drew outrage over these comments.
Turning Ahmad Arbery into a victim after the choices that he made does not reflect the reality of what brought Ahmad Arbery to Satilla Shores in his khaki shorts with no socks to cover his long, dirty toenails.
Hogue's comment drew audible gasps from the courtroom. Ahmad Arbery's mother, Wanda Cooper Jones, was so upset she got up and briefly left the trial. She later condemned Hogue's remarks.
She described Ahmad as his long legs and his dirty, long toenails. That was just beyond rude. Regardless of what kind of toenails he had, what size legs he had, that was still my son. And my son actually was running for his life.
Evidently, you can make that kind of comment in a Georgia courtroom. In Connecticut, Governor Lamont and Senator Blumenthal crowed about the move of a crypto company into the state. There wasn't the slightest hesitation about Connecticut being involved in an industry that requires thousands and thousands of advanced computers running 24/7 using enormous amounts of electricity, most of which is produced by the burning of fossil fuels, and all to invest in something backed by no government in the world, for which the world already has a substitute. It's called money. That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I am Stanley Heller for The Struggle.